Alan, welcome to Waterstones.
Thank you.
I'm really intrigued to talk to you about Our Evenings, a novel which covers a span of over 60 years and covers some really, really big topics like race and class, privilege, sexuality. And that makes it quite a tricky thing for me to know where to start in terms of my questions. So I wondered actually if I could ask where this novel started for you.
Always hard for me to say because novels sort of accumulate in my mind in a rather indescribable fashion. I think I knew that I wanted to write something which was about an outsider, as I characteristically have done, but they've always been gay outsiders, and sort of outsider-insiders, they exist in an interesting kind of liminal position. But to complicate it further by making this gay outsider someone who is recognisably different because of their race. It's something I wanted to do for a long, and it seems to be quite a sort of urgent and interesting thing to imagine the life I've led in the world that I've led, but from a different racial perspective. But of course it has all sorts of hazards.
Yeah.
And I knew it would be absurd for me to write from the point of view of a Jamaican immigrant or something. And anyway, there's a rich literature already being written by Jamaican immigrants. So the idea that it would be a biracial person who was sort of half an Englishman but half something completely other seemed to be quite a fascinating way of going at it. And this, and the Burmese, being half Burmese, is also, as he says himself, towards the end, fairly niche. And I think that was probably the initial motor of the thing. I think I wanted to write something that dealt with Brexit and our relation to Europe, but in a very kind of oblique way. And as you know, the book starts with a little sort of present day preamble in which Brexit is looming. And the time scheme of the book actually covers, by design, from the sort of moments when the UK is first trying to join the EU to the time when we make the decision to leave it. So that gave it a sort of overarching shape. And after that, it was a question of how I could best dramatise the difference of this person. And I saw that as he wins a scholarship to quite a posh school from a relatively modest background, he's someone who's going to be sort of performing certain roles, and indeed he's being schooled into becoming an exemplary Englishman. But he's always sort of play acting to some extent. And so the idea that he would develop a specific skill as an actor became rather irresistible. So I think those were the three sort of initial ingredients in the book for me, probably. But as I say, it's hard for me to put it together at all, clearly, in retrospect.
I was going to ask about that aspect, as you say, of somebody who becomes an actor later in their life, but who has been performing in much of their life, from childhood. And it's interesting that you knew that was sort of part of their trajectory. This thing about race is really interesting, and before getting into, I suppose, the plot of the book, you mentioned that carries certain hazards, and I know that there's been a lot of discussion in recent years about who gets to write what stories and who should be allowed to, I suppose. What did you do, I suppose, to make sure that you felt absolutely 100% confident that you were able to tell the story of this person who, as you say, has a different sort of racial background to yourself, for example?
Yes, I was exercised by it a bit. I think one of the things from the start was seeing that it would be written in the first person, and to write it in the third person would be to presume a kind of authorial omniscience about this person. To write from the inside, from the first person, is a kind of admission of the limitations of your knowledge. It would seem odd if I, as a third-person narrator, withheld information, but it's quite natural for someone writing their memoir to withhold information. So that seemed to me that I was removing myself, as it were, as a notionally kind of white person describing the life of a person of colour, and doing my best to enter into how I imagined that his life would be. I mean, my view has always been that creative writers should be able to enter into the point of view of anybody. What really matters is how well they do it.
Yeah.
But it was delicate, and I've been very relieved that various people of a whole range of ethnicities have read it, have sort of seem to have felt that I more or less got it right. But I didn't enter into it lightly.
No.
But I thought also it just had enormous interest. It was a completely fascinating experience to try and think of someone living through those decades and through those worlds, who was just set apart by his appearance.
It's done, I think, wonderfully subtly, and there's a phrase that you'll hear quite a lot nowadays, which is microaggressions. And for me, one of the great successes of this book was the way in which you drop these into the story, and you feel how sharp they are, and yet how sort of small and subtle these things are. Little things that people say, little gestures, little looks. There's a moment where he and his mother are walking and they pass somebody on a path, and it's just to do with a look that is sort of shot in their direction, and it speaks volumes. Tell me a little bit about creating those moments.
Well, I suppose they were quite an important part of it, really. I'm very aware of the whole question of microaggressions, which has been written about a great deal, and of course observed microaggressions repeatedly in practice with people around me. I think also I wanted to create in Dave Wynne, the narrator, someone who rides over these. So he registers them, and he's shocked at that moment when he's just a young teenage boy walking with his mother, and this other woman avoids them on the path and gives them a horrible look. He's had to recognise from early on that being the brown-faced child of a white single mother in a little Berkshire market town in the 1950s and 60s rather sets them apart. They are sort of conspicuous, and it's clear that they have been sort of ostracised or badly treated by various people in the past. So he's grown up aware of this. But I didn't want him to be a victim. I thought that would make for something terribly depressing. I wanted from the start him to be someone who's quite resilient, and he's intelligent. I mean, he has a natural intelligence, and he's academically clever, and has a generally optimistic sort of cast of mind. And so he's living his life, and these things happen, but he's not, as a rule, overwhelmed by them. I mean, as you know, he has a sort of affair, in the second part of the book, with a black actor, an African actor, which was a way for me to sort of say something about the kind of gradations of racial prejudice in English society at that time in particular, and that Dave, as a mixed-race English-Burmese boy, is more acceptable in a lot of respects than this purely black person is. And Dave, of course, well, you could even call them they're more than microaggressions. Macroaggressions that his boyfriend is subject to, and which actually become a sort of great source of tension between them. Because Dave is sort of much more acceptable somehow than he is. But the idea, I hope, is that Hector, the black boyfriend, is actually a brilliant actor, and probably a much better actor than Dave himself is. But he just does not have the opportunities.
No.
Because the aggressions, of course, take all kinds of forms. And in the world of the theatre, which Dave tries to get into, it would be impossible for him starting a career in the early 70s, looking like he does, to get into sort of mainstream theatre, which is why he finds himself pushed out into this sort of eccentric world of a sort of alternative theatre company. But here are these people with immense talent, but the system will not let them thrive.
Tell me a bit about writing the world of theatre. As you say, at the particular period that you're writing in, there is this experimental, almost avant-garde theatre that's happening, very politicised. Did that require a lot of research, or was that something that you felt was sort of very much part of your own cultural life?
It wasn't really a big part of it, though I was aware of it growing up, and when I first, I suppose when I was at Oxford in the early 70s, and the time of Gay Sweatshop and things like that. It wasn't a big part of my life, so it did involve a certain amount of very enjoyable research. And there's a marvellous book by Simon Callow about becoming an actor at the Drama Centre where he trained under Christopher Fettes, and the sort of tyrannical teacher. So I rather adapted the idea of him to the man who runs this travelling theatre company, who's really a monster. And the idea is that the group rehearses in an entirely democratic way, and sort of maturity and openness from all. Actually, it's a total tyranny. So all that was quite fun to do, and I enjoyed it. Yes.
This is a novel in many ways about sexuality. There's a really interesting beginning, I suppose, to it, which is that at this very posh school that he goes to on a scholarship, it's a boarding school for boys, and there is this kind of strange homoerotic attention behaviour that's sort of tied in with bullying and control and all that kind of stuff. There's a marvellous moment towards the end where he wonders whether these men who went on to become husbands, leaders and politicians and the rest of it can remember the things that they used to do when they were at boarding school. But it's a really interesting thing, isn't it, this sort of this burgeoning sexuality in an environment where the lines are quite blurred.
Yes, that's right. It's very interesting for the person who at some level, probably quite early on, knows that they are gay, and that is how they, the thing they're going to have to adjust to. And so there's the participation, and there's the sort of denial and everything else. I mean, I could have written a lot more about that than I did, but I wanted that to be an element in the past of these various people who we then meet much later in life. Yes, Dave remembers it all very well, but they're the ones who've grown up and married and so forth now, important politicians. Remember it at all. He wonders. He feels they must do, but we'll never know.
Never know. No, exactly. Keep it very well hidden. We see through the course of the book several of his relationships that he remembers in great detail, and it is in many ways a book about falling in love, or about love more generally perhaps, but each of those relationships are very different for him, I suppose. He's sort of learning something new about life and relationships and love. Tell me a little bit, if you can, about charting that for him.
Yes, I suppose there is a sort of progress. Yes, so he's someone who's grown up without a father, so he tends perhaps to be drawn to older men, and he has it's more than a crush, I think. But at school we see he has this very intense, entirely proper relationship with a master who takes a great sort of nurturing interest in him. And the first time he really falls in love as an adult in his sort of last term at Oxford is with an extremely nice but straight boy who's not going to reciprocate. So he has all that experience of heartbreak, and it's sort of an element in a big sort of complicated crisis that comes right in the centre of the book. Yes, and then later on, I mean, one misses out so much, of course. And this is a book written notionally by a man in his 60s about it, so huge amounts are skipped. But the first sort of proper affair we see him having is with a man 10 years older than himself, to whom he's just sort of sexually magnetised. I think he's quite fun, and they have a good time. But all along, he's not totally sort of satisfied, perhaps not intellectually satisfied, but. And he throws him over for the black actor he finds himself working with some extraordinary sort of chemistry. Dynamic reveals itself when they're rehearsing some very intense scene together. And that too sort of ends in heartbreak for him. So yes, I suppose he's going through various sentimental sort of travails as a young person. And we see him, much later in life, having met someone very suitable.
Very suitable.
And settled down and got married to him and living a life which would have been completely unimaginable to the young man of the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah.
And being I think pretty happy really.
I suppose the other great love of his life is his mother. As you say, he's grown up without a father, and we don't know much about him at all. But he has this lovely relationship with his mother, and in fact, I suppose the title of the book is referenced in several ways, very, very subtly and cleverly. You mentioned the master who he sort of has a bit of a crush on at school, who he plays in music, and one of the pieces of music, Janacek, is that?
That's right. Yeah. Yes, this little piano piece called Our Evenings.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I remember I dug that out whilst I was reading, because I thought, well, I want to hear that now. You mentioned a painting, and so then I had to find that to see what that was. But with his mother, he mentions their evenings, and it is about this sort of time that they have together. And also, I suppose, a time when she lets her guard down slightly, the time when she's most likely, I suppose, to reminisce and to maybe say something about the father who's not there. Tell me a bit about their relationship, because it's just wonderful.
Yes, well, that was another thing I might have mentioned right at the start, really, as being sort of fundamental to my idea of the book. Yes, the intimacies, the strengths of a relationship in which huge amounts are never said, the things about the mysterious Burmese father whom Dave never knows, which she generally keeps very much to herself, and it's not clear how much there is to be known about it, really. But obviously a subject of some uneasy fascination to him, particularly as a schoolboy, so that he invents stories about his father or whatever, the various glamorous and heroic things that he might have done. But the mother is the person with whom, of course, he lives, and who, when he goes away to boarding school, finds herself spending her evenings alone, and then begins to develop her own sort of romantic life in a rather unexpected way. And she enters into what will be a sort of lifelong relationship with another woman. And I rather like the idea of they're never saying anything explicitly about their relationship.
Yep.
And Dave, going through Oxford, realizing he's gay, falling in love with this man, feeling all the tension demands of his sexuality, but not quite being able to say to his partner. And they have effectively a sort of collective coming out to each other, and they say, well, of course, we all knew all along. But I rather like the idea of having in this Berkshire market town in the 1960s this little queer family, the lesbian couple and the gay son of one of them, living their lives. The hints that people may look rather askance at them, and certainly other people in the family, and Dave's mother's horrible brother, who sort of rejects her completely, and is a sort of a bully and tyrant, but feels that she has, he says she's disgraced the family name, not once but twice, first by having a brown child as a single mother, and then by becoming a lesbian. So I like the idea of pitching that very alternative thing again into this extremely conventional world. And he goes away from them. There are periods when he's... But generally, I think their bond is the great thing that runs the whole way through the book.
You mentioned how the book begins with, I suppose, the spectre of Brexit, and then we come full circle and we come back to that moment. But actually, large parts of the book aren't really about that at all. It is very much a sort of a framing thing. But I wonder whether, because of having that frame, you mentioned the various things that had gone into, that had fed into this book, how you felt as you were finishing it, what it might be saying, I suppose, to people reading it today after we've been through Brexit.
Well, of course, a lot has happened since I started writing it, and in fact, Brexit actually took place. I mean, the vote had happened, but And so the working out of the thing, or rather the not working out of the whole thing, has been something that we've been living with. And I don't think it is a book with a message exactly, but it's obviously depicting a sort of a cluster of elements in British public life to do with notions of nationhood, the other, the immigrant, and so forth. Dave, of course, isn't an immigrant, but people often sort of look at him. They mention immigration, then do a sort of double take.
Yeah.
So I feel all those issues are sort of. I hate to think of myself as writing anything kind of issue-driven, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
But these things are in play throughout the book, if you like, and they come at the end of the book into a much sharper focus.
Is there something about culture, as you said, that the book covers a period where there's some really exciting things happening culturally, and obviously Dave, with his job in theatre, gives you a chance to look at art, music and theatre. And you have great fun towards the end of the book where the son of the family who have provided him with the scholarship, who has gone on to become a government minister, who has no cultural bones in his body, but ends up becoming Minister for Culture at one point. But I just thought that was really interesting that when we think about government and ministers and people having completely inappropriate jobs, quite often it is something like culture where you're thinking, how is that person now in charge of?
Mind-boggling, yes.
But you must feel this as a novelist when you sort of see what's happening politically, and I suppose post-Brexit, one of the things that is struggling still is
well, terribly, yes. That becomes explicit, I think, the sort of moment when Brexit is about to happen. That actually the people in Dave's own professional world are likely to be extremely incommoded by this happening, and that it's a terrible assault on them as well as everything else. And of course, the years post-Brexit have been, I think really through the whole of the last 14 years since austerity was introduced in the coalition government, it's been a punishing time for the arts. And has shown little signs of getting any better. As
I said at the beginning, it's one of those books that, because of its scope, not just in time, but I suppose the subjects it's dealing with, there are so many things I could talk to you about with this book, but I don't want to take up too much of your time.
No.
I just wondered whether, because there are these lovely moments of tenderness amongst the moments of, I suppose, those microaggressions we're talking about, and those sort of that feeling of attack. I wondered if you had any sort of favourite moments to write, because there are several of them for me as the reader. I just wonder if there's anything for you as the author.
I think it took me such a long time to write it that I've rather forgotten. The section that I wrote last was the Oxford section, in fact, which I did I wrote it quite fast, and I think I felt I had sudden access to a whole pool of memory which I hadn't really tapped before, which is a fascinating thing about getting older as a novelist, I think, and particularly if, like me, this is the third book I've written which has a sort of at least half-century sort of time span. You're looking back, and something very strange happens. I mean, the way that, and Dave sort of talks about this a bit himself, the way periods of the past, which you've more or less ignored, suddenly open up, and you have an extraordinary degree of recall about them. Whereas things that have happened relatively recently, that's where the tempo of the book speeds up at the end. But those early scenes, they sort of dilate as you think about them. And I think I had that experience with writing the Oxford section. And all sorts of things I wasn't quite expecting sort of came to the surface. And I thought it sort of came off. And that, of course, it contains this sort of turning point crisis that Dave goes through. Generally, I quite enjoy writing the sort of funny and sort of semi-satirical scenes.
Yeah.
I enjoyed writing the big scene at the Posh Literary Festival.
Yes. That rang a few bells.
I don't know. It's sort of a peculiar mixture of pleasure and pain writing. I think when I was younger, I more often had an experience of kind of exhilaration in writing and sort of being outside myself. And, now it's all rather more painstaking and hard work.
That moment of crisis that he has at Oxford that you've just mentioned is so visceral, and I'm so glad I read it after my son had finished his exams recently this summer,
Right.
because I think I would have found it impossible to deal with. So.
Very good, good.
Alan, it's such a pleasure to have some time to speak to you about our evening, so thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me.